It is 1936, and the earthly remains of George V, King of Great Britain and Emperor of India, are carried in state through London, and a worldwide empire mourns. The 1930s were years full of history, a history accelerating towards a precipice, a history dominated by European events, by the rise of dictatorships. In the cliched phrase of so many accounts, Europe was marching to war. The storm clouds of conflict were gathering. In the British Empire, no less great tides of historical change were in motion. Ideas were spreading throughout all peoples of the empire. Old certainties and assumptions were being questioned by both the ruled and their rulers. New technologies of communication were spreading ways of seeing that undermined the empire. Subject peoples saw their own place in the world and saw the world as it was. The imperial belief in a duty to educate and improve actually undermined the empire, creating leaders among its subject people who were able to argue in the language and culture of the British. Some British slowly realized that their days of mastery were numbered. They were seeing themselves as a medium-sized European power, not the climax of world civilization. If not dictators inciting political frenzy, then the iconic images of the 1930s are the lines of unemployed, of closed and decaying industries. The British people looked to their own homes and jobs. The British government pursued conservative economic policies with balanced budgets. Living in an impoverished country, the British saw themselves threatened in Europe. The First Great World War had shattered the self-belief of the nation, that in turn lay at the core of belief in the empire. Throughout history, empires have risen to dominion and then fallen. The fall often a violent sweeping away by invasion or revolution. The story of the fall of the British Empire is different. There was no catastrophe. The military record of the British Empire is a catalogue of near-continuous victory. Even when defeated in battle, the empire always won its wars. The fall of the British Empire is a history of gradual decline, of the will to rule failing, of the means to rule, strength and wealth failing, of ruled peoples realizing their own strength and seeing through the myths of their rulers. The dead King George was especially attached to his empire. The king's last words, officially announced to the world, were, "How goes the empire?" George V had seen his empire grow into the 20th century. The king died in a world that had air travel. He was the first British monarch to speak to his subjects via radio, the first king of the age of the sound and colour cinema. Few mourning the king's passing could have realised that in less than 10 years, a prostrated Britain would be looking at the end of its rule in India. That successor, King Emperor George VI, would end his reign just a plain king. If anything symbolically united the empire, it was the figure of the King Emperor. The British had added Oriental mysticism to the British throne and created, in the King Emperor, a semi-divine figure. As in the old tale of the Emperor's new clothes, this power to unite was a power only while people believed. George V had believed in the empire and lived a public life of serious devotion and self-sacrifice. The new king, Edward VIII, had been groomed to be King Emperor, consciously and deliberately prepared. He could communicate in the newsreel age. Edward was immensely popular all over the empire, with an apparent real feeling for the ordinary person. The prince had been sent everywhere and had probably seen more and knew more of the real world and his empire than any previous monarch. And famously, he gave it all up for love, abandoning his duty to more than 400 million for one woman. The world's media showed a king-emperor who was an ordinary man, with normal ambitions and desires. Edward was succeeded by his younger brother, George VI, who, with his Queen Elizabeth, was to show in both peace and war a fierce devotion to the empire. But the damage was done. The mystery of the king-emperor was shaken, and it was one more step in the fall of the empire. As George VI was crowned and imperial soldiers once more marched through London, the empire appeared as strong as ever. To those insiders who knew the truth, the material strength on display was not all that it seemed, in both the symbolic mythology of the empire and its real grip on world power. Britain's Royal Navy occupied paramount position in both the eyes of the ordinary citizen and the strategy of the empire's leaders. Images of massive battleships dominated British cinema newsreels, projecting the battle fleet as the embodiment of the nation. Many territories of the empire, Malta, Gibraltar, Egypt, were important because of the need to keep a steel net of naval power around the earth. In the interwar years of economic hardship, Britain was still devoting a vast share of its national wealth to keeping these sinews of steel strong. Historically, Britain attempted to keep a fleet greater in size than the next two largest navies combined, what was called 2+1. A cold truth of the interwar years was that under the guise of disarmament, Britain quietly abandoned 2+1. The burden of the massive fleet, the bases and the dockyards simply became too great for a poorer and weaker Britain. The British Empire was not simply political and military. The empire was commercial and economic. These were times of mass unemployment and resulting social unrest. In the 1930s, for the very first time, the ordinary person in the industrialized world became aware of living in what we now call the global economy. No nation was now immune from the helter-skelter of world economics. Britain came under ever greater competition from America and Japan. The empire had always been a huge market for the products of Britain's factories. In the 1930s, the empire attempted to insulate itself from the cold climate of world economics by creating a closed market, where Britain would only buy raw materials and produce from the colonies, which would in turn buy British manufactured goods. To today's sophisticated audiences, the appeal by the Australian cricket captain lecturing cinema newsreel audiences on the economy of imperial trade seems simple and naive.
I want to speak to you as a fellow Briton. We are all of the same big British family. For years, Australia has been, next to India, Britain's best customer. And our anxiety is that you, our kith and kin, shall increase our power to buy your goods by purchasing the excellent sultanas, butter, eggs, canned peaches and other products which Australia can now supply at such reasonable cost. Not only are Australian products good, the money you pay for them is spent by Australia on British goods, the result being more prosperity and less unemployment.
The British were unique in their way of seeing the world, using sporting metaphor. The definitive education of imperial administrator or colonial soldier always involved team sports, games which stressed the virtues of not letting the side down, the virtue of sacrifice for the good of the whole, of fair play and respect for the opponent, of modesty in victory. All were regarded as qualities necessary in a colonial governor, and generations of young men had been raised to see the empire as a great game. The spread of many of the world's most popular games is the work of the British. Sport was one of the unifying bonds of the empire. In particular, sport linked together the white dominions, the grown-up children of the empire. When the ideals of sportsmanship were discarded, sport could become as divisive as it could unite. In 1934, the England cricket team toured Australia. England versus Australia is one of the oldest international sporting fixtures in the world. Cricket is the definitive imperial game, a sport wrapped in a white flannel cloak of mystery, a prolonged ritual, impenetrable to all outside the British imperial family. The British ruling classes had taken a rough, fiercely competitive game and made cricket a sport of polite manners and genteel sentiment, of honesty and respect for rules in both spirit and letter, a game played in friendship. Australia had then, as always, one of the best cricket sides in the world, a team with players of style and natural ability. The English team devised a strategy, a set of tactics that obeyed the letter of the law, but which shattered the spirit of the game. Essentially, the English players aimed the hard, dense ball at the body of the opposing batsman, tactics that became known as bodyline. A succession of Australian players left the field hurt, and England soundly defeated Australia in a series of matches. Throughout the history of international sport, politics have spilled over and interfered with the game. Contests between nations, leading in turn to resentments on the field. Rarely does sport flow the other way. Nations are too sensible to let a game shade their real interests. Yet, this is just what happened in 1934. Questions about the English team's behaviour were asked in the Australian Parliament. The daughter state, the Dominion, felt betrayed. The mother country had confounded the rules of fair play that were meant to underpin the family of nations. Many historians see the bodyline affair as a key point in the history of Australia's relations with the idea of the empire. It is unimaginable that the French Empire could have descended into crisis because of sport. Of the more than 400 million subjects of George VI, more than 250 million were Indians. The interwar years saw a slow and terrible realization that the days of the British Raj, of the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, were numbered. The British in India used all the style of the Oriental monarch to create the same aura of mystery about their regime. Parades of elephants, ranks of soldiers, massive palaces, and elaborate ceremony abounded. In the age of the cinema, in the modern interwar years, the image of the Viceroy, the overall governor of India, sitting atop a golden throne, began to look more like an embarrassed middle-aged British civil servant sitting in a gold-coloured chair. In the 1920s, India grew restless and disillusioned with British rule. Indians who had loyally fought in World War I, in the fields of France and the deserts of Arabia, expected reward. Moderate Indian opinion wanted dominion status, for India to be the equal of Australia, New Zealand, Canada and South Africa. Britain had lost colonies before. It had lost a whole empire in North America. It had traded African territory in great deals over the conference tables of Europe. It had allowed colonies, such as Australia, to actually become independent while pretending to some other relationship. India was different. India was the other half of Britain. African empire was less than 50 years old. India was different. For a time, beyond living memory, Britons from all levels of society had travelled to India. Aristocrats from England's most noble families served as the viceroy. Soldiers of all ranks had spent years in India. The sons of the middle classes joined the Indian civil service. Unmarried daughters travelled to India to find husbands. Many British families had such a long tradition of connection with India, they could be called Anglo-Indian. Amongst the multitude of ethnic groups in Indian society, a distinct mixed-race community, the creation of empire, emerged. Beyond all the rhetoric of empire, India was profitable, a good investment for British industry, with productive factories, cheap labour, and a huge captive market. The map of India was a maze of different territories, not one single province. Amongst swathes of land ruled directly by British governors, there were more than 500 princely states, some of them tiny micro-countries ruled by traditional Indian monarchs who acknowledged the overall rule of the British. In return for being puppet rulers, these princes held local power, retained their fabulous wealth, and were admitted as almost honorary Englishmen. Some Rajas and Maharajas moved in London society as much as Indian. More than 40% of India's territory and more than a quarter of her people were controlled by the princely states. Again, talk of India's people ignores facts of history. India was a land of many peoples. Any map which reflected the fine fracturing of Indian society by race and religion would be an even greater confusion. The greatest and most fundamental division was between Indian Hindu and Indian Muslim. Most Muslims were concentrated in the northwest of India, or Bengal, but nearly everywhere there was division, mutual hatred and mistrust that could break into unpredictable violence at any moment. The Hindu-Muslim divide was but the most prominent fault line that ran through Indian society. Gurkha soldiers from the Himalayan mountains admitted they enjoyed killing lowlanders. An official British Army report in plain, blunt, soldierly language stated that, at the heart, the Sikh enjoys nothing more than hammering Muslims. The British exploited these divisions to divide and rule. But for every cynical British soldier or policeman that deployed the hatred of one Indian for another as a weapon, there was another Briton who saw India's divisions in the context of the white man's burden. The British believed it their duty to civilize so-called primitive peoples. India's divisions were cited as a proof that these people were unable to rule themselves. To such administrators, the British Empire was a strict but fair teacher, keeping unruly and quarrelsome children in order. Or the empire was the umpire, there to see fair play to all. India between the world wars was increasingly unstable. Indian news regularly told tales of violent disorder, of Indian killing Indian in the cities and villages of the Raj. A street argument between Hindu and Muslim schoolboys could in minutes grow into rioting lasting days with brutal massacres. Looking from more than half a century away, looking back from a time when doubting the sincerity of politicians and national leaders is the norm, it's too easy to see the sentiments of those who talked of a burden as the same sort of spin and propaganda. Most who talked of Britain's duty to the Indians really believed in good faith. If one figure dominates the entire history of India, it is Mohandas Gandhi, the great soul, the Mahatma. Gandhi is a familiar and iconic image, a tiny Indian dressed in loincloth and sandals, looking every part the Indian guru. Despite his appearance, Gandhi was every bit a creation of the British Empire. Beneath the loincloth was a London-educated barrister, a man whose favourite poetry was that of Rudyard Kipling, the man who created the phrase, "white man's burden." Gandhi was a man who enjoyed English hymns and openly admired English values of individual freedom. Descriptions of Gandhi by those who knew him reveal a complex and enigmatic personality. Some called him kindly, gentle, innocent and simple, a saint. To others, Gandhi was sly, manipulative, devious, a hypocrite. Like so many holy men and spiritual leaders who've emerged from India, Gandhi could submerge a shrewd and calculating nature beneath vague, bland, and obscure truisms. To many, Gandhi seemed an opportunist with a modern eye for the soundbite and publicity stunt. He was always going on hunger strike, creating tension and drama, though he never came close to death. Gandhi's thinking led him down many strange paths. The clothing he wore was part of a protest against imported British cloth. It was homespun, made in India, part of his protest of non-violence and simple defiance. Most Indian nationalists looked to the past, to a golden age of India. Gandhi was different. He looked to the future. Gandhi, the London barrister, expressed the desire for Indian independence as a struggle for basic human rights, the freedom of the individual to decide his own government. For people living more than half a century later, it's hard to realize that these were arguments the British had never encountered. Opposition to British rule traditionally came from kings and tribal chiefs who wanted to impose their own rule, not to give their subjects the right to vote. These were principles with which Britain found it hard to argue. Gandhi, the Indian, created a body of thought he called Satagavra, a word he translated as love force. Gandhi thought imperialism a glorification of violence. He believed imperialism would not be defeated by violence, but by opposite forces, by non-violence and by self-inflicted suffering. The target was the decency and the conscience of Britain. Again, the British were baffled by these new ideas, by civil disobedience, by mass refusal to obey minor laws, such as that controlling the sale of salt, by hunger strikes, by protests where demonstrators did not fight back or give in when policemen used force to clear blocked streets, and by trials where leaders such as Gandhi appeared to actually want to be sent to prison. Gandhi indeed did spend years in prison for inciting civil disobedience, but he always had open public trials, in the traditions of British justice. It's been said that Gandhi was lucky that he opposed the British Empire, an empire that prided itself on respecting human rights. In many other European colonial empires, he would have simply been shot. Gandhi was the public face of the Indian independence movement. Behind Gandhi was the Indian National Congress, a mass political movement opposed to British rule. The idea of the white man's burden stressed the duty to civilize, and the leaders of Congress, almost to a man, were the products of schools that modelled themselves on the English public school. They attended the same great universities that created the British ruling class. The sons of India's professionals and businessmen had been deliberately educated in Western thinking, immersed in Western philosophy. They absorbed Western ideas of freedom and of the rights of the individual. These men thought as the British and saw no reason why they should not be the equals of the colonial masters. The actual leader of the Indian Congress was Jawaharlal Nehru, a lawyer educated at Harrow, the same public school as Winston Churchill, and Oxford University, a university Churchill was deemed not bright enough to have any hope of attending. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who spoke for India's Muslims, was another British-educated lawyer who dressed in the style of an English gentleman and lived much of his life in London. These men did not wear loincloths or speak in enigmas. They spoke the articulate English of Britain's ruling class, their reasoning based on principles which the British could not contest. Though there was much that was extraordinary about Gandhi's campaign for independence, the masses of ordinary Indians, many often illiterate rural villagers, saw Gandhi as semi-divine, someone who could frustrate and confound the British. These people often failed to grasp the complex ideas of Satagavra or constitutional democracy, and often turned to violence. In the 1920s, Gandhi was imprisoned by the British. In the 1930s, he was invited to discussions with the Viceroy and then travelled to England to meet with the British government and the King Emperor. On this visit, he charmed the British people with wit and humour. When asked about the propriety of meeting King George wearing so few clothes, Gandhi replied, "Oh, it was all right. The king had on enough for both of us." His apparent openness and friendliness undermined any attempt to portray him as an enemy and his demands as extreme or unreasonable. He visited Lancashire cotton mills, directly harmed by his homespun cloth campaign, yet emerged to cheers from the very people whose livelihoods he threatened. Among the British, opinion was divided. Most British politicians sensed the course of events and went slowly along with the flow. Some, though, were determined to swim against the tide. Winston Churchill, a man whose time was yet to come, was a die-hard opponent of any compromise with the Indian Congress movement. Churchill was advised by a former viceroy to talk to Indians and find out the reality of Indian politics. Churchill's reply was robust. "I am quite satisfied with my views on India, and I don't want them disturbed by any bloody Indian." Churchill called Gandhi a naked Indian fakir. Indian nationalists simply demanded freedom, a plain demand that actually masked the countless ethnic and religious divisions of the vast population and concealed the demands of many princely states to achieve their own independence. The time frame for these demands was now. The moderate British saw the future history in terms of a slow, gradual evolution, of a system of negotiations, of vetoes, of checks and balances, of guarantees to minority rights. In 1935, concessions were made, and India was given a small degree of self-government, with an eventual vague promise that someday dominion status would be achieved. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, an otherwise able man who had a notoriously bad record of predicting the future, the man who promised peace in our time, also, in a less famous prophecy, predicted that India might achieve nationhood by 1980. Most of India's millions had never seen an Englishman. The Indian Empire was maintained in the minds of the Indian population. If the illusion of British supremacy was destroyed, if the Indian no longer believed, the Indian Empire was lost. The tide of history was running against Britain. Those British families that had served the Indian Empire for generations saw the writing on the wall. Fewer and fewer young men came forward to join the Indian civil service. It was no longer a career with a future. It was always a remarkable fact that so many millions were ruled by so few British troops and administrators. By the 1930s, there were fewer than 500 white British administrators in the Indian civil service. By 1939, the Empire had already lost India. The Indians knew this, and most astute Britons did too. Britain in India at this time has been described as a man riding a runaway elephant. He wants to get off, but can't get down. India was the largest of Britain's territories and amongst the oldest. It was a province torn by both a demand for independence and by internal hatred and division. This was a history shared with one of the empire's smallest and newest territories. Palestine, the Holy Land, had been given in trust to Britain by the League of Nations after World War I. To the British Empire, a Christian empire, it had seemed a fulfillment of a particular destiny. In Palestine, the British Empire was to be swamped by a powerful torrent of history that had been building for nearly 2,000 years. Since an older empire, that of the Romans, had smashed the Jewish state in violence. The British Empire had itself unleashed the forces of change. In 1917, Britain had promised a national home for the Jewish people, a move to swing American support behind the British war effort. At the same time, the Arab people had been set afire with a new spirit of nationalism, a fire sparked by the British as they stirred revolt amongst the tribes of Palestine and Arabia against their Turkish Ottoman masters. After World War I, the international Zionist movement encouraged and organized increasing numbers of Jewish settlers to migrate to Palestine. The new Jewish settlers were educated, sophisticated and wealthy, able to buy land that was cheap. They displaced the Arabs of Palestine. The more extreme argued for the creation of an independent Jewish nation. Tension grew in Palestine, which the British authorities attempted to relieve by controlling Jewish immigration. By the early 30s, it seemed stability would come to the Holy Land. Most Jews that wanted to go to Palestine had done so. Under British rule, the health and wealth of the Arab population began to grow. Then, in 1933, the threads of world history joined up. The coming to power of Hitler's Nazis created a new exodus of refugees. In a few years, a Palestinian Jewish population of 20% rose to more than 50%. Jews became the majority. In 1936, the Arabs of Palestine rose in rebellion. Newsreel of these years showed the Holy Land a place of constant turmoil and political demonstration, of riot and agitation. They show scenes which translate into the language of more than half a century later. British soldiers conducted random searches. There were internment camps. British soldiers and officials were kidnapped, held hostage, and murdered. Buses were attacked. The passengers were killed in cold blood, and the terrorists perversely described the murders as executions. There were bombings, often suicide bombings. Crowds of youths, Jewish and Arab, stoned British soldiers. Terrorist leaders were deported. The British Army would conduct demolitions of whole villages thought to harbour rebels as reprisal, retribution, and deterrence. In the eye of this storm of hatred, the British attempted to play their traditional role as arbiter of fair play to both factions. Working parties of the great and good travelled to Palestine to find a solution. In 1937, the British offered partition, giving both sides land to call their own, and with curbs of new Jewish immigration. but both sides rejected the proposals in furious anger. The fascist powers of Italy and Germany stirred trouble, with agitation among the Arabs. The last years of the 1930s saw the British take severe and harsh measures to pacify Palestine. As World War was about to break out, the Empire was intending to impose a settlement. The coming war would change all plans and plot a new course for all parts of the British Empire. Among the many trends and flows of history that conspired to make the empire a thing of memory were forces of competition. In the Far East, the Empire of Japan viewed that of Britain with open avarice. The British Empire in the Far East had its own particular character. Britain was one of a number of European powers that dominated China, effectively controlling the huge Chinese state by controlling the ports and trading cities on China's coast. Cities such as Shanghai and Hong Kong were sophisticated and semi-European. Japan regarded China as being in its backyard and desired to replace all Europeans. The British Empire directly controlled Malaya and Borneo, both wealthy in resources, particularly oil and rubber, which a resource-poor Japan eyed with hunger. In Australia and New Zealand, European peoples were expanding into the vast spaces of near-empty lands. To Japan, a crowded island even then, this seemed unjust. Japanese politicians nakedly declared their belief that it was the right of the Japanese to settle the Pacific Rim. British industry was undermined by Japanese economic competition. The cotton goods of Lancashire were being replaced by Japanese imports. America provided yet more pressure upon the empire of trade. In the 19th century, the Victorian Empire, at its height, had built railways that covered the world. In the 20th century, a measure of the fall of the British Empire is that the cars, the trucks and the tractors that were the new symbols of progress, their numbers a new measure of improvement, were usually made in America. It is not to say that the British Empire was complacent. All over the empire, grand projects were pursued, and the imperial government tried to see the empire as a unified economy. The Nile was dammed at Aswan for irrigation and hydroelectricity as a benefit to all the extended British family, both Egyptian cotton farmer and Lancashire spinner. The story of the 1930s, of the European dictatorships, is another story. Hitler openly recorded his admiration of Britain. He saw the empire as a proof of his racial theories. When war broke out, he declared his aim was not to destroy the British Empire. He saw Germany dominating Europe and Russia, Britain the rest. When World War II broke out, the empire moved unanimously behind Britain. Once again, imperial troops were summoned to fight. "Carry on, Britain, Barbados is with you," was a famous cable received in London. All the British family knew there would be no future for its way of life if Britain lost the war. While Hitler may have borne the empire no ill will, this was not true of Germany's allies. Italy coveted British territory in Africa, and Japan sought the dismemberment of British rule in the Far East. As American ships burnt at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese unleashed a wave of invasion, taking Malaya, taking New Guinea and Borneo, besieging and capturing Hong Kong, and bombing northern Australia. If there was one single event of the war that was a blow to the very core of the British Empire, it was Japan's capture of Singapore in 1942. Between the wars, the money for a huge state-of-the-art naval base had been scraped together by an impoverished British Empire. The result was a naval fortress that was both a symbolic and actual proof of national strength and security. Australia and New Zealand saw a British fleet at Singapore as the guarantee of their protection. Singapore was indeed a handsome imperial city and commercial centre, a place where Europeans abroad could live good lives whilst earning fortunes. In January 1942, the mighty fortress stood effectively empty, quietly abandoned. The battleships which should have lain at anchor were fighting in the Mediterranean defending Egypt. The fighters which should have lined Singapore's airfields were shooting down bombers in the skies of southern England. There were no modern weapons anywhere. In January 1942, Japanese armies swept southwards down the Malay Peninsula towards Singapore. 2 British battleships were sunk by Japanese aircraft. The Grand British Plan had always imagined Singapore attacked from the sea by a navy of another European power, not from the land by an army of Asian people. Famously, all the big guns pointed out to sea. On the 15th of February, the Japanese laid siege to Singapore, and the forces of the British Empire were compelled to surrender. As nearly 150,000 marched into captivity, 200 years of imperial history were destroyed. Asians never looked at the British in the same way again. The British Navy had failed. The British Army had been outfought. White men had panicked and surrendered to an army of Asians. The Japanese continued their advance, invading Burma, fighting on the very borders of India. The Japanese brought a message of liberation to the native peoples of the British Empire. Many of the Indian troops captured by Japan went over to the Japanese side to fight as the Indian National Army for Indian independence. With the Japanese battering at the gates of India, Gandhi chose to reopen his demands for the British to leave and inspired a wave of protests and strikes. It showed a capricious, cynical, and opportunistic streak in the great soul. The British regarded it as near treason. A fascinating what-if is to imagine how events would have turned out had Japan liberated India. There would have been no fair trial for any Congress leader who opposed a Japanese governor. In other former European colonies, the Japanese introduced a regime that was harsh and exploitative. The British wrongly saw their imperial subjects as children needing guidance, but the Japanese imperialist saw those same people as subhuman, barely above animals. The British government dispatched a cabinet minister, Stafford Cripps, to India to negotiate a settlement. Cripps, a socialist sympathetic to Congress, met with Nehru, Jinnah, Gandhi, and all the other representatives of Indian nationalism. Cripps offered what Indians had demanded after World War I, dominion status, the equal of Australia or Canada in the family of the empire, if the protests ceased and the Congress Party backed the war effort. He was rebuffed. The British were to crack down on opposition, and for the last time, Gandhi found himself in a British jail. Many thousands of Indian soldiers took part in the fighting that eventually beat back the Japanese and brought victory over the forces of dictatorship all over the world. They fought with bravery, honor, and distinction, as did troops from all over the empire. America and Russia emerged from the war strengthened as the two superpowers that would dominate the world in the coming decades. Britain emerged from the war weakened, bankrupt, and industrially destroyed. The USA was, in its very act of creation, a rejection of the British Empire, having fought a war of independence. Early in World War II, Britain and America signed a declaration of common war aims, the Atlantic Charter. Churchill travelled to meet American President Roosevelt in grand imperial style on a battleship of the Royal Navy, beneath the mighty guns of which the Charter was signed before the cameras of the world. One clause of the Charter declared the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they live. Churchill, the die-hard imperialist, argued, reasoned, blustered, raged, and in the end pleaded with Roosevelt that this clause should exclude the British Empire. The American was immovable. When the leaders of the great powers sat around the conference tables of strategy, the Americans were always at their most suspicious and their least sympathetic when they saw a hidden British agenda to save the empire rather than defeat fascism. America did not believe its young men fought and died in the Solomon Islands to see the British simply reclaim their Pacific Island colonies. America was privately furious that Hong Kong's governor, on his liberation by Americans, quickly ran up the Union Jack, restoring the status quo in the British colony. America looked to a new world order and saw the goal as saving China from communism. Soviet Russia, by definition, saw imperialism as the highest expression of capitalism. The Russian Tsar had been deposed and killed, and yet the USSR inherited the Tsar's ambitions to interfere and meddle with British rule in India. And so this superpower, like the Americans, saw no reason to support the British Empire. In 1945, America became the preeminent power in the post-war world. American approval was needed for any policy that Britain might wish to pursue. American economic strength meant America bankrolled Britain, and hence the empire. America had resented the empire's pre-war attempts to sabotage free trade with imperial protection and demanded access to the vast markets that the empire offered. When the war ended, a strong US economy stepped into the place of a worn-out Britain and supplied even more goods that Britain could not. Wherever in the world the Americans went, they always stood out in contrast to the British. They made the empire look stuffy, old-fashioned, pompous and weak. The world could see that America plotted the path to the future. The rainy streets of London witnessed the last true march of the empire in the victory parade of World War II. There would be other marches, but they would be sham, theatrical nostalgia. As soldiers from all over the world marched past the King Emperor that day, the forces of history that had been slowly gathering for most of the 20th century were about to burst upon the empire and change the lives of all her people, both great and small. Within the lifetime of most present, even the aged Churchill, then aged 70, the empire would come to live only in memory.